Welcome back to On the Edge with me, Theo Chalmers, and my special guest, John Hemming. John, we were just talking about shaken baby syndrome.
Yeah, it's one of the problems you have with the medical research into maltreatment of children, child abuse, is the simple point that ethically, you can't just take a load of babies, shake them and see what happens. Right? So there hasn't been any research, and rightly so, there hasn't been any research into finding out what happens when you shake a baby, because you shouldn't shake babies. It's very simple principle, don't shake babies, right? Mm-hmm. There is an argument as to whether the triad of symptoms, subdural hematoma, retinal hemorrhages and the brain sort of bruising, is only caused by shaking, or whether it can have other causes.
Now, such as genetic defects?
Genetic defects. There is a genetic defect which is has particularly by the Amish in America, which is known as glutaric aciduria. And glutaric aciduria, which means you've got glutaric acid in your urine as a symptom, is children which have that have a higher propensity to SBS. And they, at one stage, were all taking them into care until they thought, oh, why are we taking these kids into care? Why isn't suddenly a spate of shaking going on here? And they conclude,
yeah, that's not the Amish, that's the Shakers. Sorry.
All right, fair enough, okay. Let's come back to this one.
Yeah.
So glutaric aciduria is another one. Now, the work done by Bart's recently, they looked at 36 cases where there were subdural hematomae, where it happened to babies either in the womb or just after birth, and identified that babies had subdural hematoma without any child abuse.
Because this has happened in the womb?
Because it's happened in the womb or in hospital. Where
and they're incredibly well protected in the womb, aren't they?
Well, you know, there are issues as to how it happens. But there is now evidence that in the first 2 months of life, subdural hematoma can happen spontaneously. Obviously, there may be a propensity to it. Babies have weaker veins and the like.
When you say the first 2 months of life, you mean in the gestation period or
post-birth?
Post-birth, okay.
Post-birth, right? And then we have the question of retinal hemorrhages, where it's been identified the retinal hemorrhages can happen as well up in the first 2 months, ordinarily. So, and there hasn't been research done to just look and see what happens as to the third of the triad. And the argument has been that for a baby to get hurt that badly, that the brain is damaged, so they get sort of cerebral palsy or whatever it may be, either the neck has to show some damage because the shaking was so intense, because it's a question of how much G-force you can achieve shaking a baby.
And they've got very heavy heads, babies, don't they, relative to their neck size. And
whether the neck gets hurt or, for instance, their head gets hit against something, right? Because obviously, if you've got bruising on the outside of the skull, then there's evidence that something untoward has happened. So there's an argument, both on the biomechanical basis, which is like the physics and mechanics of the brain. There's arguments as to what can cause this to happen spontaneously. And we have a case which was reported, again, you can see the judgment on my weblog, which it was reported recently, where a father whose son, by his first wife, had these symptoms at about 2 months old. So it falls fairly and squarely into this category, right, where there is evidence that this can happen naturally. Right? And he was trying to appeal this. Now, what happened was his son, he had a daughter, and then his son had this happen.
And the daughter was fine?
His daughter was fine. His son had this happen and got brain damaged, ended up with cerebral palsy. And he still sees his son quite a lot, right? He's got no limits on his contact with his son, but he split up with his wife, and he married somebody else, and they had a baby, and they took the baby off them after 4 days old because of what happened to his son, but they don't think there's sufficient risk to his son to stop him seeing his son.
Is that because no one wants to adopt a baby with cerebral palsy?
I think that's part of the story. And there was a case where they handed back in Westminster, there was a case about 2 years ago where a child was handed back to parents and then hurt very badly. And the reason they gave for handing the child back was they couldn't get the child adopted. Now, the logic of that is wrong.
Sounds to me like people are making money.
I think people, we get the case from, was it Fulham? Again, a lot of these things are on my weblog. And there's links to all the other websites with the original material.
Let's talk about the weblog briefly again. It's John Hemming, that's all one word.
John Hemming, all one word,
.blogspot.com.
Yeah, and that's a sort of useful source for references to these cases.
Okay, so this man whose previous child had suffered this trauma,
but remarried. He didn't take the previous child. He remarried.
And did they lose the baby?
Well, the baby was being taken off them. They're still struggling away at the moment. They're
still trying to get the baby back.
They're trying to. We've filled in the papers to go to the Court of Appeal, and it falls fairly and squarely in the territory covered by this recent reported research, reported 2 weeks ago, basically. And we'll see what happens there, but it's not like the Webster's case where they say, well, we can't reverse the adoption because it's happened, although in fact you can reverse adoptions. But
well, I was going to ask you about that. Is this a good time to ask you that question?
If you want to ask me that question, it's a good time to ask it.
Let's ask that question then, because I've read that once adoption has happened, it can never be undone, and some humongous miscarriages of justice have occurred, but because the adoption is final, all adoptions are final. And yet earlier you spoke about these failed adoptions, this
that's, you see, what it is, when parents give up on a child, or the child gives up on the parents, and they go back into care, the adoption is, inverted commas, disrupted.
But then officially they're no longer the parent, are you saying?
Well, the thing is, they give up parental responsibility. So it's not really the reversing of adoption by the courts saying that's reversed.
What if, for instance, the adoptive parents were to be abusive and that ended up in court and they had the children removed from them?
Yeah, but it wouldn't reverse the original adoption. It might result in a subsequent adoption.
So is there some sort of legal process that formalises the removal of children from their natural parents or from their adoptive parents?
There's lots of processes. The basis upon which a child is taken into care and their parental responsibility is shared between the local authority and the parents initially is what's called, it happens under the 1989 Children's Act in England and Wales, and it's where a child is deemed to be at risk of significant harm. All right?
Okay.
So
but
that's the phrase used.
Okay.
They haven't really defined what that means.
Yeah, that's that, because it occurs to me that, you know,